The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty general store, and Willa Preston's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she stepped down onto the wooden planks of Paso Robles, California. Her carpetbag clutched so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. It was September of 1878, and she had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Robert Kendrick, who had placed an advertisement seeking a wife in the Eastern newspapers. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Willa could feel sweat trickling down her spine beneath her travel-worn dress as she looked around at the town that would become her home. Paso Robles was smaller than she had imagined, with a main street lined with wooden buildings that seemed to shimmer in the heat, and she could see rolling hills in the distance dotted with oak trees. A tall man separated himself from the shade of the general store's awning, and Willa's breath caught in her throat. He was broad-shouldered and lean, wearing dusty work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. As he approached, she could see he had dark hair that needed cutting, a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds that studied her with an intensity that made her want to step backward. "Miss Preston?" His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling in a stream. "Yes, Mr. Kendrick?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended, almost swallowed by the sound of horses and wagons passing by on the street. He nodded once, reaching for her carpetbag. "Welcome to Paso Robles. The wagon's just there." He gestured to a sturdy farm wagon hitched to two horses, its bed filled with supplies. "We'll head to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride." Willa followed him, her legs unsteady after days of travel. Robert Kendrick was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 29, and nothing like the aging widowers who usually sought mail-order brides. She was 22 herself and had come west not out of desperation, but because her father's death had left her alone in Philadelphia with no family and diminishing prospects. Marriage to a Western rancher had seemed like an adventure, a chance for a new beginning. The ride to the ranch was mostly silent. Robert kept his attention on the road, and Willa studied the landscape, so different from the green hills of Pennsylvania. The oaks here were gnarled and spread wide, offering pools of shade in the golden grasslands. Cattle grazed in the distance, and she could smell dust and dry grass and something sweet she couldn't identify. The sky stretched endlessly blue overhead, bigger than any sky she had ever seen. "The ranch has been in my family for 10 years, Robert finally said, breaking the silence. "My father built it up from nothing. He passed 2 years ago. My mother died when I was young. It's just me now, with a couple of hired hands who help with the cattle and horses." "I'm sorry about your father," Willa said softly. She understood loss, understood the hollow ache of being alone in the world. Robert glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. "He would have liked you. He always said this place needed a woman's touch." The ranch came into view as they crested a low hill. It was more substantial than Willa had dared hope, with a main house built of wood and stone, a large barn, several outbuildings and corrals where horses moved restlessly in the afternoon heat. The house had a covered porch that wrapped around two sides, and Willa could see curtains in the windows, yellowed with age and dust. Robert pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, then came around to help Willa. His hands were strong and calloused as he lifted her down, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground, stepping back as though burned. "Let me show you the house," he said, grabbing her carpetbag and heading up the porch steps. The front door stood open to catch any breeze, and Willa followed him inside. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A worn sofa and chairs arranged before it, and a dining table near the kitchen area. Everything was neat but dusty, and clearly lacking a woman's presence. Robert set her bag down and moved through the room, gesturing. "Kitchen's there. Pump outside brings water to the sink. Stove works well enough." He pointed to a door on the left. "That's my room." Then to a door on the right. "That one's yours. There's a third bedroom upstairs, but it's mostly storage now." Willa's throat tightened. Separate bedrooms. She had known this marriage would be one of convenience, at least at first, but the reality of it still stung. She moved to the door he had indicated as hers and pushed it open. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the barn. The late afternoon light slanted through the dusty glass. "I'll give you time to settle in," Robert said from behind her. "There's a basin and pitcher on the dresser. Supper's usually around sundown. Nothing fancy. I'm not much of a cook." Willa turned to thank him, but he was already walking away, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. She heard him cross the main room, and then the sound of a door closing. The sound was sharp and final, and Willa found herself trembling, her whole body shaking as though she had taken a chill despite the warmth of the afternoon. She sank down onto the bed, her hands pressed to her face, and tried to steady her breathing. What had she done? She had traveled across a continent to marry a stranger, and now she was alone in a small room in a house that didn't feel like a home, with a man who barely looked at her. The closed door of his bedroom seemed to echo with finality, and Willa felt tears prick at her eyes. She had expected awkwardness, had expected to need time to adjust, but she hadn't expected to feel so utterly isolated. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the ranch. Two men were working near the barn, and she could see Robert striding toward them, his hat pulled low against the sun. He moved with confidence, completely at ease in this world that was so foreign to her. Willa pressed her palm against the window glass, feeling the warmth radiating through it, and made herself a promise. She would not give up. She would not let fear win. She had come here for a new life, and she would make the best of it, no matter how difficult it seemed now. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her two spare dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her hairbrush and the small silver mirror that had been her mother's on the dresser. The physical activity helped calm her nerves, and by the time she heard movement in the main room, she felt steadier. Robert was at the stove, frying bacon and heating beans. He glanced up when she emerged from her room. "Hope you're hungry. It's not much, but it's filling." "Can I help?" Willa asked, moving toward the kitchen area. "No need, almost done." He dished food onto two tin plates and carried them to the table, then fetched 2 cups and a pot of coffee. They sat across from each other, and Willa realized this was the first meal she would share with her husband. The food was simple but well cooked, and Willa discovered she was ravenous. They ate in silence for several minutes before Robert spoke. "The Reverend can come out from town in a few days. Make it official." He didn't look at her as he said it, keeping his eyes on his plate. "All right," Willa said. She wanted to say more, to ask him questions, to learn something about this man she had agreed to marry, but he seemed to surround himself with silence, like a wall. After supper, Robert stood and collected the dishes. "I'll handle these. You must be tired from traveling." It was a dismissal, and Willa recognized it. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Thank you for supper." He nodded, his back already to her as he worked at the sink. Willa retreated to her room and closed the door softly behind her. She changed into her nightgown and lay down on the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. She heard Robert moving around the main room, heard his door open and close. But this time, she noticed, the sound was softer, not the sharp slam from earlier. Willa woke to the sound of roosters crowing and early morning light filtering through her window. She dressed quickly in one of her work dresses and emerged to find the main room empty, coffee still warm on the stove. Through the window, she could see Robert and his hired hands already at work near the barn. She poured herself coffee and looked around the kitchen, taking inventory. If she was going to live here, she might as well make herself useful. She spent the morning cleaning, scrubbing years of dust and neglect from the kitchen and main room. The physical work felt good, purposeful. She found fresh eggs in the henhouse and made a simple lunch of eggs and the bread she discovered in the pantry, wrapped in cloth. When Robert came in at midday, he stopped short, looking around at the transformed room. The windows gleamed, the floor was swept clean, and the smell of dust had been replaced with the scent of lye soap and cooking food. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, removing his hat. "I wanted to help." It's my home now, too. Willa set a plate of food in front of him at the table. Robert sat slowly, studying the meal. I haven't had anyone cook for me in a long time. Then it's about time someone did. Willa sat across from him with her own plate. Tell me about the ranch. What do you raise? He seemed surprised by the question, but after a moment he began to talk. The ranch ran cattle primarily, with some horses. He sold beef to the army fort 20 miles north and to the growing population of San Luis Obispo. The work was hard but honest, and the land was good. As he talked, Willa could see some of the tension ease from his shoulders, and she asked more questions, genuinely interested in learning about the life she had entered. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Robert rose before dawn and worked until dusk. Willa cleaned and cooked, tended the vegetable garden she found behind the house, collected eggs, and began making small improvements to the house. She sewed new curtains from fabric she found in a trunk upstairs, and she reorganized the kitchen to be more efficient. Robert was gone most of each day, but they shared meals together, and gradually he began to talk more. The Reverend came on a Thursday, a jovial man named Father Murphy, who served the scattered Catholic families of the region. The ceremony was brief and simple, held in the main room of the ranch house, with Robert's two hired hands as witnesses. Willa wore her best dress, a blue calico she had made herself, and Robert had clearly made an effort, his hair freshly cut and his face cleanly shaven. When Father Murphy pronounced them husband and wife, Robert took Willa's hand briefly, his grip warm and firm, then released her just as quickly. That night, after the Reverend and the hired hands had left, Willa stood in the main room, uncertain. They were truly married now, and yet nothing had changed. Robert moved toward his bedroom, pausing at the door. "Good night, Willa," he said, and closed the door behind him. Willa stood there for a long moment, staring at that closed door, feeling the trembling start in her hands again. She was a married woman now, but she felt more alone than ever. She went to her own room and sat on the edge of the bed, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. What kind of marriage was this, with walls between them, with barely a touch exchanged? She had expected time to grow comfortable with each other, but this felt like more than caution. It felt like rejection. The next morning, Willa woke with determination. She would not live like this, with silence and closed doors between them. If Robert wanted a marriage in name only, he should have said so in his letters. She'd come here willing to build a life with someone, and she would make him understand that. She made breakfast and waited for Robert to come in from the morning chores. When he sat at the table, she placed food in front of him and then sat down herself, folding her hands in front of her. "Robert, we need to talk." He looked up, surprise crossing his face. "About what?" "About this marriage, about why you wanted a wife in the first place." Willa kept her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "You barely speak to me. You close yourself away every night. If you wanted someone to just cook and clean, you could have hired help. So why did you send for a bride?" Robert set down his fork, his jaw tightening. For a long moment he said nothing, and Willa thought he might simply get up and walk away. But then he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on something past her shoulder. "I was married before," he said quietly. 5 years ago. Her name was Catherine. She was from town, the daughter of the banker. We were married less than a year when she died in childbirth. The baby died, too. Willa felt her breath catch, understanding flooding through her. "Robert, I'm so sorry." He shook his head, still not meeting her eyes. "This place was too lonely after that. Too quiet. I thought having someone here again might help. But I don't expect anything from you, Willa. I know you didn't sign up for a widower still grieving his first wife. You're free to live your own life. I won't burden you with expectations." "That's not fair," Willa said softly. "Not to you, and not to me. I came here to build a marriage, Robert, not to be a ghost in your house." He finally looked at her, and she could see pain in those gray eyes. Pain and fear. "I can't promise you anything. I don't know if I can be what you need." Then let's start small, Willa said, standing up. She walked to his bedroom door, the one he had closed so firmly every night, and pushed it open. Then she left it standing wide and returned to the table. No more closed doors. We live in the same house, Robert. We don't have to shut each other out. Robert stared at the open door, something shifting in his expression. He swallowed hard and nodded once. All right, no more closed doors. It was a small change, but it felt monumental. That evening, when Robert came in for supper, Willa noticed he had left the door to his room open when he went to wash up for the meal. Her own door stood open as well, and there was something about it that made the house feel different, less like two separate people existing in the same space and more like a shared home. Over the weeks that followed, the open doors became a symbol of other changes. Robert began staying in the main room after supper instead of retreating immediately to his bedroom. They would sit together, Willa with her sewing and Robert carving small pieces of wood, a hobby he admitted he had neglected for years. They talked more, sharing stories of their childhoods, their families, their dreams. Willa learned that Robert had wanted to be a horse trainer before his father died and left him the ranch. Robert learned that Willa had been trained as a teacher but had lost her position when her father fell ill and she had to care for him. One evening in late October, Robert came in from work to find Willa struggling to move a heavy trunk down from the upstairs bedroom. He took the stairs two at a time and lifted the trunk easily, carrying it down to the main room. What's all this? He asked as Willa opened the lid. I found it upstairs. It's full of beautiful things. Look. She pulled out carefully folded quilts, embroidered linens, delicate china plates. These must have been your mother's. Robert knelt beside the trunk, touching the quilts gently. I haven't seen these in years. My father packed them away after she died. I was only 7. They're too beautiful to hide, Willa said. We should use them. Together, they went through the trunk, and Robert shared memories of his mother, stories Willa could tell he hadn't spoken aloud in years. They draped one of the quilts over the back of the sofa, and Willa carefully washed the china plates, setting them in the cabinet where they could be seen. The house began to feel more lived in, more like a real home. November brought cooler weather and the first hints of rain. The cattle were moved to lower pastures, and Robert spent long days checking fences and preparing for winter. One afternoon, Willa convinced him to teach her to ride. He saddled a gentle mare named Daisy and led Willa to the corral, his hands steady and patient as he helped her mount. Keep your heels down, hands soft on the reins, he instructed, walking alongside as the mare moved in a slow circle. That's good. You're a natural. Willa felt exhilarated, sitting high on the horse's back, seeing the ranch from this new perspective. Robert smiled at her, a real smile that reached his eyes, and she felt warmth spread through her chest. This was what she had hoped for when she came west, these moments of connection, of building something together. As winter approached, they fell into an easy companionship. Robert began staying longer after supper, and sometimes Willa would read aloud from the newspapers that came from San Luis Obispo while Robert listened, his hands busy with his carving. He made her a small wooden box for her sewing notions, the lid inlaid with a delicate pattern. She knitted him a warm scarf for the cold mornings, using yarn she had purchased on a rare trip into town. It was on one of those cold December evenings, with rain pattering against the windows and a fire crackling in the hearth, that everything changed. They were sitting together on the sofa, closer than usual because of the chill in the air, and Willa was reading about political developments in Washington. She glanced up to find Robert watching her, not the paper, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. Willa, he said softly, and there was a question in his voice, a tentative hope. She set the paper aside. Yes? I don't want separate rooms anymore. His voice was rough with emotion. I don't want to keep living like we're strangers. I don't want to keep pretending I don't care about you because I do. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being the mail order bride I sent for and became the person I look forward to seeing every morning. You became home. Willa felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were happy tears. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. I was waiting for you to realize that. Robert pulled her close, and when he kissed her, it was gentle and searching, full of all the words they hadn't yet said. Willa melted into him, her hands coming up to frame his face, and the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Robert rested his forehead against hers. I'm scared, he admitted. I'm scared of losing you like I lost Catherine. You won't lose me, Willa promised. I'm stronger than I look, Robert Kendrick, and I'm not going anywhere. He kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. When he lifted her into his arms and carried her to his bedroom, the door standing open wide behind them, Willa knew that they had finally, truly become husband and wife. The winter passed in a blur of happiness. They moved Willa's belongings into the larger bedroom, and the smaller room was closed up, no longer needed. Robert was different now, more open, quicker to smile and laugh. He would steal kisses when he came in from work, would pull Willa into his arms while she cooked supper, would hold her close through the cold nights. They talked about everything, making plans for the ranch, for their future together. In February, Willa missed her monthly courses, and by March she was certain she was pregnant. She told Robert one evening after supper, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. There's a baby, she said simply. Our baby. Robert's face went pale, then flushed, and she could see fear and joy warring in his expression. Willa, I can't lose you. I won't survive it. You won't lose me, she said firmly, pulling him close. I promise you, Robert, I'm healthy and strong. We're going to have this baby, and everything will be fine. He held her tightly, and she felt him trembling. She understood his fear, knew it came from the deepest wound of his past, and she held him until the shaking stopped. Over the following weeks, Robert was almost overprotective, not wanting her to do anything strenuous, worrying constantly. Willa had to remind him gently that pregnancy was natural, that she was capable of continuing her daily tasks. I'm not fragile, she told him one morning when he tried to prevent her from hanging laundry. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I promise to be careful, but you have to let me live my life. Robert nodded reluctantly, but she could still see the worry in his eyes. As her belly grew through the spring and summer, he became more settled, especially after the midwife from town visited and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, promised to come stay at the ranch when Willa's time approached. They prepared the small bedroom upstairs as a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and bringing down a beautiful cradle that had been stored in the barn. Robert's mother had made it, he explained, and he had been born in it, and so had his father before him. Together, they sanded it smooth and oiled the wood until it gleamed. Our baby will sleep here, Willa said, rocking the cradle gently. And someday, our grandchildren. Robert stood behind her, his arms around her swollen middle, his chin resting on her shoulder. I love you, Willa. I don't say it enough, but I do. You saved me. I was drowning in grief and loneliness, and you pulled me back to life. I love you too, Willa said, turning in his arms to kiss him. You gave me a home, a purpose, a family. Everything I'd lost, I found again here with you. In early November, almost exactly a year after they had pushed open those closed doors, Willa went into labor. Mrs. Henderson arrived and took charge, sending Robert and his hired hands out of the house. Robert paced on the porch, his face drawn with worry, while inside, Willa labored through the afternoon and into the evening. It was full dark when the baby's first cry pierced the night air. Robert froze on the porch, his heart in his throat, waiting for Mrs. Henderson to emerge. When the midwife finally opened the door, she was smiling. You have a son, Mr. Kendrick, a healthy, strong boy, and your wife is doing beautifully. She wants to see you. Robert practically ran to the bedroom. Willa was propped up against the pillows, looking exhausted but radiant, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of his mother's quilts. He approached slowly, almost afraid, and Willa smiled at him. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Robert sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby's face, red and wrinkled and perfect. The baby had a shock of dark hair and was waving tiny fists in the air. Robert felt tears slide down his face as he carefully touched one of those impossibly small hands, and the baby's fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. "He's perfect," Robert whispered. "You're perfect. Thank you, Willa. Thank you for this gift." "What should we name him?" Willa asked. Robert thought for a moment. "William, after my father. William Robert Kendrick." "William!" Willa repeated, smiling down at their son. "It's perfect." Mrs. Henderson stayed for 3 days, making sure both mother and baby were thriving, then departed with payment and promises to check on them the following week. Robert took time away from the ranch work to help Willa, learning to change diapers and walking the floor with William when the baby was fussy. He was a natural father, patient and gentle, and Willa fell even more deeply in love with him watching him cradle their son. The months that followed were busy and exhausting and wonderful. William was a healthy baby who nursed well and grew quickly. By his first birthday, he was toddling around the ranch house, getting into everything, and both Robert and Willa couldn't imagine life without him. One evening when William was 2 years old, after they had put him to bed in his nursery, Robert and Willa sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills. Robert had his arm around her shoulders, and Willa was leaning against him, content. "Do you ever regret it?" Robert asked quietly. "Coming all the way out here to marry a stranger?" Willa looked up at him, surprised. "Never. Not for a single moment." "Do you regret sending for me?" "No. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." "Well, you and William." He kissed the top of her head. "I was thinking today about that first week, how I would close my door every night, shutting you out. I was so scared of letting you in, of risking my heart again. I'm glad you were brave enough for both of us." "I was terrified," Willa admitted. "That first night when you closed that door, I was shaking so hard I thought I might fall apart. I felt so alone. I know, I'm sorry for that." Robert tightened his arm around her. "But you didn't give up on me. You pushed open that door, literally and figuratively, and you kept pushing until I let you in. I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." "The rest of our lives," Willa corrected, "which, God willing, will be very long and full of many more blessings." As if on cue, Willa felt a familiar flutter in her belly. She had confirmed her suspicion just that morning. She was pregnant again. She had been waiting for the right moment to tell Robert, and now seemed perfect. "About those blessings," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach. "William is going to be a big brother." Robert's face lit up with joy. All the fear from the first pregnancy gone now, replaced with pure happiness. "Really? Another baby?" "Really, probably next spring." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, then held her close. "I love you so much, Willa Kendrick. Thank you for this life we're building together." They sat on the porch until full dark, making plans and dreaming about the future. The doors of their home standing open behind them, welcoming in the cool evening breeze and the sounds of their son sleeping peacefully in his nursery. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Willa knew what to expect and Robert was less fearful. She remained active through the winter, though Robert still fussed over her, especially as her belly grew large. William, at 2.5, was fascinated by the idea of a baby, patting Willa's stomach and talking to his unborn sibling. In April of 1882, on a warm spring morning when wildflowers covered the hills in blankets of color, Willa gave birth to twin girls. Mrs. Henderson was there again, and this time she let Robert stay in the house, though not in the bedroom. When she finally called him in, Willa was holding 2 tiny bundles, and Robert's eyes went wide with shock and delight. Twins, he breathed. We have twins. 2 daughters, Willa said, exhausted but beaming. They're beautiful, Robert. Come see. The girls were identical, with wispy blonde hair like their mother and delicate features. They were smaller than William had been, but Mrs. Henderson assured them this was normal for twins and that both girls were healthy. They named them Rose and Ruth, and from the beginning, the girls were inseparable. As they grew, their personalities emerged. Rose was bold and adventurous, while Ruth was quieter and more thoughtful, but they did everything together. William was a devoted big brother, protective and gentle with his baby sisters. The ranch prospered over the following years. Robert expanded the cattle operation and began breeding horses as well, fulfilling his old dream of being a horse trainer. Willa managed the household and helped with the ranch's business affairs, keeping books and managing accounts. They hired more help as the operation grew, and the ranch became one of the most successful in the region. When the twins were 3 years old, Willa discovered she was pregnant again. This fourth pregnancy resulted in another son, born in the winter of 1885. They named him Thomas, after Willa's father, and he completed their family. Thomas was a quiet, studious child, different from his more boisterous siblings, and he had a special bond with Willa, often sitting with her while she read or worked on her correspondence. The children grew up surrounded by love and the beautiful landscape of California's Central Coast. Robert taught all of them to ride, and they spent long days exploring the ranch on horseback. Willa taught them to read and write, and when Paso Robles finally got a proper schoolhouse, all 4 children attended, though they often complained that they learned more from their mother at home. One summer evening when William was 12, the twins were 9, and Thomas was 6. The family gathered on the porch after supper, as had become their tradition. Robert sat in his favorite chair with Willa perched on the arm, his hand resting on her waist. The children were playing a game with sticks and stones they had invented, their laughter ringing out in the warm air. "Do you think they understand how lucky they are?" Willa asked Robert quietly, watching their children play. "They will when they're older. Right now this is just their normal. They don't know any different." Robert looked up at her, his gray eyes warm with love. "But we know how rare this is, what we've built here." Willa leaned down and kissed him softly. "The best decision I ever made was getting on that stagecoach east. The best decision I ever made was admitting I needed someone and sending for a bride," Robert replied. "And then the second best decision was listening when you told me to open that door." They sat together, watching their children play as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, and Willa thought about that first terrifying night in a strange house with a silent, grieving man who had shut her out. She thought about the trembling fear that had consumed her when he closed his bedroom door, how alone she had felt, how uncertain of her future. And then she thought about the courage it had taken to push that door open, to demand that they at least try to build something real together. It had been worth every moment of fear, every difficult conversation, every step toward each other. They had built not just a marriage, but a family, a home, a life full of love and purpose and joy. The open doors had been the beginning, but what they had created together went far beyond that simple gesture. They had opened their hearts as well as their doors, and that had made all the difference. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new blessings. There were difficult times, droughts that threatened the cattle, illnesses that swept through the household, the inevitable struggles of raising 4 strong-willed children. But through it all, Robert and Willa faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing year. William grew into a tall, serious young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. He started taking on more responsibilities as he entered his teenage years, and Robert began teaching him everything about managing the land and the livestock. It was clear that William would one day take over the ranch, and he approached the prospect with maturity and dedication. The twins, Rose and Ruth, were forces of nature. Rose wanted to break horses like her father, scandalizing some of the more traditional families in town by insisting on wearing split skirts so she could ride astride. Ruth was quieter, but no less determined, developing a talent for training dogs and breeding the ranch's working animals. Both girls were beautiful and smart, and by the time they were in their mid-teens, young men from neighboring ranches found excuses to visit more frequently. Thomas, the baby of the family, developed an unexpected passion for books and learning. By the time he was 10, he had read every book in the house, sometimes 2 or 3 times. Willa wrote to her old friends in Philadelphia, asking them to send books, and soon Thomas had a small library of his own. He talked about going to university someday, perhaps becoming a lawyer or a teacher, and while Robert had initially hoped all his sons would want to ranch, he supported Thomas's dreams. In the spring of 1892, when William was 18, he approached his parents with a request. He wanted to marry Sarah Miller, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sensible girl with a good head for business and a genuine love of the land. Robert and Willa gave their blessing, and the wedding was held at the ranch in June, with half of Paso Robles in attendance. Willa watched her eldest son marry, and she thought about her own wedding, that brief ceremony with only Father Murphy and 2 hired hands as witnesses. William and Sarah's wedding was so different, full of music and laughter and celebration, but the love in William's eyes when he looked at his bride reminded Willa of how Robert looked at her still, after all these years. "What are you thinking?" Robert asked, coming to stand beside her as the dancing began. "That I'm getting old," Willa said with a laugh. "My son is married. I'm old enough to be a grandmother." "You're as beautiful as the day you stepped off that stagecoach," Robert said, pulling her into his arms for a dance. "More beautiful, actually, because now I know what's inside as well as outside." They danced together as the sun set, and Willa marveled at how her life had turned out. She was 36 years old, with 4 healthy children, a prosperous ranch, and a husband who still made her heart race when he smiled at her. It was more than she had ever dreamed possible on that terrifying day when she arrived in California, uncertain and alone. True to expectation, Sarah announced she was pregnant in the fall, and in the summer of 1893, Willa and Robert became grandparents to a baby boy named James. William and Sarah built a house on the ranch, close to the main house but separate, giving them privacy while keeping the family close together. Willa loved being a grandmother, loved watching William experience the joys and terrors of parenthood that she and Robert had navigated years before. The twins turned 18 in 1893, and both were courted by various young men from the region. Rose fell in love with a horse trader named Daniel, who shared her passion for breeding and training horses. They married in a small ceremony and moved to a ranch 20 miles north, though Rose visited often, bringing her growing string of prize-winning horses to show her father. Ruth surprised everyone by falling in love with the new school teacher in Paso Robles, a gentle, scholarly man named Peter, who appreciated her quiet intelligence. They married and stayed in town, where Ruth helped Peter with his teaching and raised champion cattle dogs. Thomas, at 13, continued to devour books and announced he wanted to apply to university in San Francisco. Robert struggled with the idea of his youngest child leaving the ranch, but Willa gently reminded him that they had always encouraged their children to follow their dreams. "He's not rejecting us or the ranch," Willa said one night as they lay in bed, Robert's arms around her. "He's becoming who he's meant to be. We should be proud." "I am proud," Robert admitted. "I just don't like the idea of him being so far away." "San Francisco isn't the moon," Willa teased, "and he'll come home for visits. Besides, William is here and the girls are close. We're not losing our family, just expanding it." Robert kissed her forehead. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from experience," Willa said. "I left everything I knew to come here, remember? And it turned out to be the best decision of my life. Maybe Thomas's adventure will be the same for him." In the fall of 1895, Thomas left for university in San Francisco, and the house felt emptier without him. But he wrote long letters home, full of excitement about his studies and the city, and he came home for Christmas, regaling them with stories about his professors and classmates. Willa could see how happy he was, and that made the distance easier to bear. As the century drew to a close, Robert and Willa found themselves in a new phase of life. They were still active and involved in the ranch, but more and more, William was taking over the day-to-day management, allowing Robert time to focus on the horse training he loved. Willa spent her days tending her garden, which had grown into something magnificent over the years, visiting with her daughters and grandchildren, and reading the books Thomas sent home from the city. One evening in November of 1899, almost exactly 21 years after Willa had arrived in Paso Robles, she and Robert sat together on the porch, bundled in blankets against the chill. The ranch was quiet, with William and Sarah in their own house and the other children scattered to their own lives. It was just the two of them again, as it had been in the beginning. 21 years, Willa said, breaking the comfortable silence. It's hard to believe. Best 21 years of my life, Robert said, pulling her closer. Do you ever think about how it started? How scared we both were? All the time. I remember trembling when you closed that door the first night. I thought I had made a terrible mistake. Robert winced. I was trying to be respectful, giving you space. I didn't realize I was pushing you away. I know that now, but I'm glad I had the courage to push back, to make you see that we needed to try. I'm glad too. I was drowning in grief and loneliness, and I didn't even realize it. You saved me, Willa. You brought me back to life. They sat in silence for a while, and then Willa said, Do you remember what you said to me once? That I stopped being the mail order bride you sent for and became home? I remember. You became home for me too. This place, this life, you, the children, all of it. This is where I belong. This is where I've always belonged. Robert turned to face her, his gray eyes still bright despite the lines around them, his hair now streaked with silver. I love you, Willa Kendrick. I loved you when you pushed open that door and demanded I let you in. I loved you when you told me you were carrying William. I loved you through every moment of the past 21 years, and I'll love you for however many years we have left. I love you too, Willa said, tears sliding down her cheeks. And I'll never regret getting on that stagecoach, never regret taking a chance on a stranger who needed someone as much as I did. They kissed then, as tender and sweet as their first kiss had been, but with the depth and richness that came from 2 decades of shared life. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. The new century arrived with celebration throughout the region, and the Kendrick family gathered at the ranch to mark the occasion. William and Sarah were there with their 3 children now, the youngest just 6 months old. Rose came with Daniel and their 2 daughters. Ruth arrived with Peter and their son. Thomas came home from San Francisco, where he was now in his 2nd year of law school, bringing with him a young woman named Elizabeth, who he shyly introduced as someone special. They had a grand dinner in the main house, the table extended with extra boards to accommodate everyone, and afterward they all stood outside to watch the stars and toast the new century. Robert raised his glass and looked around at his family, at the life he and Willa had built together. To family, he said simply. To love, to new beginnings, and to all the years ahead. To family, everyone echoed, and the sound of their voices carried across the ranch, full of joy and hope. Later that night, after everyone had gone to their respective homes or retired to guest rooms, Robert and Willa lay in their bed, exhausted but happy. The house was full of the sounds of their family sleeping, and Willa thought about how different this was from that first lonely night 21 years ago. We did it, she whispered to Robert. We built something beautiful. We did, Robert agreed, pulling her close. And it all started because you were brave enough to demand an open door. They fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had every night for the past 2 decades, and the door to their bedroom stood open, as it always did now, welcoming in the sounds of the home they had created together. The years that followed brought more changes and more joys. Thomas married Elizabeth in 1902, and they settled in San Francisco, where Thomas opened a law practice. William and Sarah had 2 more children, giving Robert and Willa 7 grandchildren in total. Rose and Ruth each added to their families as well, and family gatherings became increasingly chaotic and wonderful, with children running everywhere and the house full of noise and laughter. Robert and Willa aged gracefully, their hair turning silver, their faces lined with wrinkles earned from years of laughter and hard work and living fully. Robert developed a reputation as one of the finest horse trainers in California, and people came from as far as Los Angeles to buy his horses. Willa's garden was famous throughout the region, and she started sharing seeds and cuttings with other women, teaching them her techniques. In 1910, when Willa was 54 and Robert was 60, they celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary with a party that brought together their entire extended family. There were now 12 grandchildren, ranging in age from 6 months to 17 years, and the ranch rang with their voices and laughter. "This is your legacy," William told his parents during the celebration. "Not just the ranch, but this family. The love you built together created all of this." Willa looked around at the children playing, at her own children now grown with families of their own, at the prosperous ranch and the beautiful land, and she felt overwhelming gratitude. She had started with nothing but courage and hope, and look what she had now. That evening, as the guests departed and the house quieted down, Robert and Willa walked together through the ranch, as they often did. They stopped at the corral where the horses dozed in the twilight, then walked up to the top of a small hill that overlooked the property. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the rolling hills stretched out before them, golden and peaceful. "Do you remember the day you arrived?" Robert asked, his arm around Willa's waist. "You looked so scared standing there with your carpet bag, trying to be brave." "I was terrified. Everything was so different from what I had known. But I looked at you and thought, maybe this could work. Maybe we could build something together." And we did. We built everything. Robert gestured at the ranch spread out below them. "But you know what I'm most proud of?" "What?" "That I listened to you when you told me to open that door. That was the moment everything changed. That was when I started to heal, when I started to let myself hope again." Willa turned in his arms to face him. "I was shaking so hard that night when you closed your door. I felt so alone. But I knew I couldn't give up, couldn't let fear win. So I opened that door, and I told you we needed to try. It was the bravest thing I'd ever done. It was brave, and I'm grateful every day that you didn't give up on me." "On us." Robert cupped her face in his hands, his touch still tender after all these years. "You're still the best thing that ever happened to me, Willa Kendrick. And you're still the man I choose every single day," Willa replied, kissing him softly. They stood together on the hill as darkness fell, watching lights flicker on in the various houses scattered across the ranch property. Their children and grandchildren were settling in for the night, safe and loved and part of the legacy Robert and Willa had created together. It was more than either of them had ever dreamed possible on that uncertain day in 1878 when a frightened young woman had stepped off a stagecoach and into an unknown future. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, the door stood open ahead of them, lights spilling out into the darkness, welcoming them home. It had been open for 32 years now, and it would stay open for all the years to come, a symbol of the love and trust they had built together, one brave choice at a time. Robert and Willa continued to thrive as they entered their later years, both remaining active and engaged with the ranch and their growing family. Robert trained horses until he was well into his 70s, only slowing down when his joints began to protest the long hours in the saddle. Even then, he supervised the younger trainers, passing on his knowledge and techniques. Willa maintained her garden and became something of a matriarch in Paso Robles, hosting regular gatherings for the women of the community and mentoring young brides who were nervous about their new lives. She always told them the same thing: be brave, be patient, and never be afraid to push open a closed door if it stands between you and happiness. Their grandchildren grew up hearing the story of how their grandmother had traveled across the country to marry a stranger, how she had trembled when he closed the door on their first night together, and how she had bravely insisted he leave it open from then on. It became family legend, a story about courage and love and the power of small gestures. In 1920, Robert and Willa celebrated their 42nd anniversary. Robert was 70 years old now. Willa was 64, and they had 15 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. The ranch was thriving under William's management, expanded to 3 times its original size, and the Kendrick name was respected throughout California. The anniversary celebration was held at the ranch, and children and grandchildren came from as far as San Francisco and Los Angeles. There was music and dancing, a massive dinner prepared by Willa with help from her daughters and daughters-in-law, and toasts that went on until everyone was laughing and crying at the same time. "Tell us the story," one of the younger grandchildren begged Willa as the evening wound down. "Tell us about the door." Willa looked at Robert, and they shared a smile full of shared history and enduring love. "Well," she began, settling into her chair with several grandchildren gathered around her feet. "It was September of 1878, and I was very young and very scared." She told the story, as she had many times before, but it never got old. The children listened with wide eyes, and even the adults who had heard it dozens of times leaned in, captivated by the tale of courage and love that had started their family. "And from that day on," Willa concluded, "the door was never closed between us again. Not just the bedroom door, but our hearts. We learned to be open with each other, to share everything, to face the world together instead of separately. That's the secret to a good marriage, children. Keep the doors open always." Robert reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "Best advice anyone could give, and the best decision I ever made was listening to this wise woman right here." As the family gathered around them, 3 generations strong, Willa thought about that frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 42 years ago. She thought about the trembling fear, the closed door, the loneliness. And then she thought about the courage it had taken to demand something better, to insist that they at least try to build a real marriage. That courage had given her everything: a husband she loved deeply, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a beautiful home, a purposeful life, all because she had refused to accept closed doors and chosen to be brave instead. Robert and Willa lived to see their 50th anniversary in 1928. By then, Robert was 78 and moved slowly, his body worn from decades of hard work. Willa was 72, her hair pure white, her hands gnarled from years of work in the garden, but their love was as strong as ever, perhaps stronger, tempered by 50 years of partnership. The golden anniversary celebration was the largest gathering the ranch had ever seen, with over 100 family members in attendance. There were speeches and tears and laughter, and when Robert and Willa danced together slowly to a song played on William's gramophone, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. 50 years, Robert murmured as they swayed together. 50 years with the woman I love. How did I get so lucky? We both got lucky, Willa replied, resting her head on his shoulder. We found each other when we both needed someone, and we had the courage to build something real together. The open door, Robert said, and Willa could hear the smile in his voice. It all comes back to that open door. It all comes back to love, Willa corrected gently. The door was just the beginning. Love is what carried us through. They danced until the song ended, and then Robert led Willa to the porch, where they could see the stars spreading across the sky above the ranch. It was quiet here, away from the party, and they stood together looking out at the land they had tended for 50 years. When I'm gone, Robert said suddenly, I want you to know that these 50 years with you were everything. You gave me a reason to live again when I had lost all hope. You gave me children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You gave me joy and purpose and love. You were everything, Willa. You still are. Don't talk about being gone, Willa said, but her voice was gentle. They were both old now, and they both knew that their time together was growing shorter. You're not going anywhere without me. Promise me something, Robert said, turning to face her. Promise me you'll remember how much I loved you, how much I still love you. Every single day of these 50 years, I loved you more than the day before. I promise. And you promise me the same. Remember that I chose you, Robert Kendrick. Out of all the men in all the world, I chose to marry you, and I would make that choice again every single day. They stood together under the stars, two old people who had built a life together from hope and courage and love, and they knew without speaking that they had been blessed beyond measure. The trembling fear of that first night was so far in the past now, replaced by the rock-solid certainty of 50 years of partnership. Robert passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1930, at the age of 80. Willa was with him, holding his hand as he slipped away, and her last words to him were the same words she had spoken countless times over their 51 years together. I love you. The loss was profound, and Willa grieved deeply for the man who had been her partner, her love, her home for more than half a century. But she was not alone in her grief. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren surrounded her, all of them products of the love she and Robert had shared. They held her up through the dark days, reminding her that Robert lived on in all of them. Willa lived another 5 years, remaining at the ranch she and Robert had built together. She spent her days in her garden and with her family, telling stories about Robert and the life they had shared. She became the keeper of the family history, making sure the younger generations knew where they came from, how their family had started with a mail-order bride and a grieving widower who had learned to love again. On a warm evening in September of 1935, 57 years to the day after she had first arrived in Paso Robles, Willa sat on the porch of the ranch house, surrounded by several of her grandchildren. She was 79 years old now, tired and ready to rest. Tell us the story again, Grandma, one of the youngest asked. Tell us about the door. Willa smiled, her eyes distant with memory. It was September of 1878, and I was very young and very scared. I had traveled all the way from Philadelphia to marry a man I had never met. His name was Robert Kendrick, and he was the love of my life, though I didn't know it yet. She told the story one last time, her voice growing softer as she spoke. She told about the trembling fear, the closed door, the courage it took to demand that it stay open. She told about how that small act of bravery had opened not just a door, but a whole life, a whole world of love and family and belonging. When she finished, she looked at the children gathered around her and said, "Remember this, all of you. Love takes courage. It takes bravery to open yourself up to another person, to be vulnerable, to risk being hurt, but it's always worth it. Always. Your grandfather and I had 51 beautiful years together because we were brave enough to open those doors and keep them open. That's my gift to you, my wisdom after a long life well lived. Keep the doors open always." Willa passed away that night in her sleep. In the bed she had shared with Robert for 51 years, in the house they had made a home together. The door to her room stood open, as it had for 57 years, and her children found her in the morning, peaceful and still, finally reunited with the man she had loved so completely. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, family and friends and neighbors whose lives had been touched by Willa's warmth and wisdom. They buried her next to Robert on the hill overlooking the ranch, and the marker read simply, Willa Preston Kendrick, 1856-1935, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She kept the doors open. The ranch continued under William's care and eventually passed to his children and grandchildren. But no matter how many generations passed, the story of Robert and Willa was never forgotten. It became the foundation of the family, the legend that defined them. Every Kendrick child grew up hearing about the mail-order bride who had trembled when her new husband closed the door, and how she had bravely demanded he leave it open from then on. They learned that love takes courage, that family is built on trust and openness, and that sometimes the smallest gestures can change everything. The house on the ranch still stood decades later, preserved by the family as a testament to their founders. And inside, the door to the master bedroom remained open, a symbol of the love that had started a dynasty and a reminder that when you open your heart and your life to someone, the rewards are beyond measure. In the end, Robert and Willa's story was simple. Two lonely people who found each other and had the courage to build something beautiful together. They faced fear and grief and uncertainty, but they chose love. They chose openness. They chose each other every single day for 51 years. And in doing so, they created a legacy that would endure for generations, all because one brave woman refused to accept closed doors and insisted on something better, something real, something worth the risk. Their love story became the stuff of family legend, told and retold through the decades that followed. It was a reminder that the greatest love stories often start with the smallest acts of courage, and that choosing to be vulnerable, choosing to trust, choosing to leave the door open instead of closed can change not just two lives, but the lives of everyone who comes after. Robert and Willa Kendrick had given their family more than land and property and prosperity. They had given them an example of what real love looked like: brave, honest, enduring, and always, always open